The morning light in Bar Harbor carried a soft chill that clung to the trees outside Martha Ellison's cabin. A pale fog drifted through the woods, brushing against the porch rails and the glass panes of her kitchen window. Martha moved slowly, the way people do when they've learned that silence has a rhythm of its own. The kettle hissed quietly, a small sound in a house that had forgotten laughter. She was stirring her oatmeal when the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway broke the stillness. Through the curtain, she saw the delivery truck pause at her mailbox. The driver waved once, left a small parcel, and drove off without waiting. Martha frowned. She hadn't ordered anything. She wiped her hands on a dish towel, stepped out onto the porch, and picked up the package. It was wrapped neatly in brown paper, tied with thin twine, and bore no return address. Only her name was written across the top in blue ink, Martha Ellison. Inside, beneath a layer of tissue paper, was a bottle of whiskey, amber liquid glowing faintly like trapped sunlight. The label read Golden Glen Reserve, a brand she remembered from long ago, one her late husband had loved. There was also a card. She unfolded it carefully, and her fingers paused when she saw the handwriting. "Happy birthday, Mom." The letters slanted just slightly to the left, the same way Lydia's had when she was a child learning cursive. 3 years had passed since Lydia's last message. 3 years since the funeral, since that final argument when her daughter had said, "You were always stronger with books than with people." The words had stayed lodged somewhere deep, too painful to touch. Martha set the card down beside her teacup, staring at the bottle. She didn't drink anymore. Not since the doctor told her about her heart, the arrhythmia, the dizzy spells. And Lydia had known that. That thought pressed against her chest, heavy and strange. Gifts from Lydia had always come with meanings she couldn't quite read. Was it a gesture of peace, or guilt, or something in between? She turned the bottle in her hands, feeling the cool glass, admiring the golden hue that shimmered through the morning fog. It looked expensive, too expensive for something casual. She thought of Daniel Cooper, the handyman who lived a few houses down the road, the one who'd helped her fix the roof after last month's storm refused to let up. He had refused payment, saying, "You've already paid with your coffee and stories." Maybe this would be her way of thanking him. She placed the bottle back in the box, sealed it gently, and wrote his name on a new label. Later that afternoon, she walked down the leaf-strewn path to Daniel's porch. The smell of pine and sea salt followed her as she handed him the package. "A small thank you," she said, smiling faintly. "I can't drink it anyway." Daniel laughed, unaware of how true that was, and promised to open it that evening with his wife, Linda. That night, as Martha washed the last dish and shut off the kitchen light, the phone rang. The number flashing on the screen made her freeze. Lydia. She hesitated before answering. "Mom," the voice said, soft, familiar, too careful. "You got my package?" "I did," Martha said. "I gave it to Daniel. I don't drink anymore." There was a pause. Then Lydia's tone shifted, thin and sharp beneath the calm. "You gave it away? You didn't try it yet?" Silence hung between them, long and heavy, until the line went dead. Martha stood in the dark kitchen, the dial tone buzzing faintly in her ear, while outside, the fog pressed closer to the windows, as if listening. The call came just after sunrise. Martha was sitting by the window, watching the fog thin into ribbons above the trees, when the phone rang. Linda's voice was frantic on the other end, shaky, out of breath. "Martha, it's Daniel. He collapsed this morning. The ambulance just took him. They think it might be poison." For a second, Martha didn't move. The word poison seemed foreign in her quiet kitchen, something that belonged in headlines, not on her phone line. "What do you mean?" she whispered, gripping the counter. "He was fine last night." Linda's words tumbled over one another, tangled in sobs. He had a glass of that whiskey you gave him. Just one. Then he said his chest hurt, he couldn't breathe, then he fell. By the time Martha reached the hospital, the sky had turned the color of pewter. The air inside the emergency wing smelled of antiseptic and fear. Linda sat near the vending machines, face pale and streaked with tears. "They're running tests," she said, her hands twisting the hem of her sweater. The doctor said his pulse was irregular, like his heart was misfiring. Martha followed her into the corridor outside the trauma unit. Through the narrow window, she could see Daniel lying on a gurney, wires running from his chest to a monitor that beeped steadily, as if trying to hold him to life. A doctor in green scrubs stepped out, his expression professional but cautious. "He's stable for now," he said. "We've sent blood samples for toxicology. There's a strong smell of alcohol, but the symptoms, they don't match a simple overdose." Martha barely heard the rest. Her gaze had fixed on a small tray beside the doctor, an open plastic bag with Daniel's personal items. Among them was the empty whiskey bottle, its golden label glinting under the fluorescent light. Golden Glen Reserve. Her stomach twisted. She knew that bottle. She had given it to him yesterday afternoon. May I see that?" she asked. The doctor hesitated, then nodded. She lifted it carefully. Even through the scent of disinfectant, the faint smell of whiskey lingered. Sharp, bitter, somehow wrong. Something chemical beneath the sweetness. By the time she reached home, the sky was darkening again. Clouds heavy with unfallen rain. The kitchen felt colder than usual. Every sound amplified. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of floorboards. She opened the trash bin, searching through coffee filters and apple peels until her hand brushed glass. She pulled out a small, clear vial, its lid missing, its bottom dusted with a thin layer of white residue. It looked like something from a science lab. Her breath caught. She placed it gently on the counter and stared at it for a long moment, the realization crawling through her mind like frost. Lydia's package, the whiskey, moving mechanically. She opened the refrigerator. The faint smell of alcohol drifted out. On the middle shelf, exactly where she'd kept the bottle before giving it away, was a small puddle that smelled the same. She took an empty jar from the cupboard, poured what little liquid remained from the bottle's cap into it, and sealed it tightly. Her hands trembled, but her movements were deliberate, careful. Then she wiped the counter, wrapped the vial in paper, and set both items inside a plastic bag. For the first time in years, she felt the house pressing against her, walls closing in, air too thin to breathe. She looked at the clock. It was 6:47 p.m. Without thinking twice, she picked up the phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the name she hadn't seen in years. Ricardo Vega, an old friend from her library days, now working at the county's veterinary lab. When he answered, his voice was the same, steady, low, unhurried. "Martha? It's been a while." She swallowed hard. "Ricardo, I need your help," she said quietly. "It's about a bottle of whiskey and maybe a man's life." The next afternoon, the fog lifted just enough for the road to show its narrow, winding edge through the trees. Martha drove slowly toward the county veterinary lab on the outskirts of town, a place she hadn't visited in nearly a decade. The building was small, plain, half hidden behind a cluster of pines, its parking lot cracked by years of frost. She held the sealed plastic bag on the passenger seat like something alive. Inside, the vial and the small jar of whiskey clinked softly together with each turn. Ricardo Vega met her at the entrance. He hadn't changed much. Same gray beard, same careful eyes. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, attempting a half smile. Martha didn't return it. "Maybe I have," she murmured. They moved to a back room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and hay. Metal shelves lined the walls, each labeled with jars, samples, and bottles of chemical reagents. Ricardo put on his glasses, glanced at the bag she handed him, and nodded. "You said this is whiskey." "Yes," she replied. "Someone drank it. He's in the hospital." He didn't ask more. Years of quiet friendship had taught him when silence served better than questions. He poured a small amount into a glass tube, added a drop of reagent, then another. Under the fluorescent light, the liquid swirled and turned cloudy. He frowned, adjusted the scope, and typed something into his computer. Minutes passed. The rhythmic hum of machinery filled the space. Finally, Ricardo straightened. "Martha," he said carefully, "this isn't a normal contaminant. I'm seeing traces of tremetol, the toxin found in white snakeroot." Martha blinked, unsure she'd heard right. "That's a plant, isn't it?" He nodded. "Grows wild around here. Farmers used to lose cattle to it. Something called milk sickness. Causes heart failure if ingested. Rare these days. You'd have to extract it intentionally." The word sank in like cold water. Intentionally. Her mind went blank, yet every detail sharpened. The sound of her own breathing, the faint tick of the wall clock, the amber liquid in the test tube glinting like deceit itself. Someone had meant to kill her, and instead Daniel, generous Daniel, had nearly died. She felt her knees weaken and reached for the edge of the table. Ricardo turned toward her. "Do you want me to call the sheriff?" She shook her head slowly. "Not yet." He hesitated, but didn't press. "This isn't something you can ignore. Martha." "I won't," she said softly. "I just need to understand first." When she got home, dusk was settling over the forest. The air smelled of pine and salt. Inside, the house felt too quiet, the kind of silence that watches. She sat at her desk by the window, took out an old leather-bound notebook, and began to write. At the top of the first page, she drew 2 columns. What I know and what I can prove. Her handwriting was steady despite the tremor in her chest. What I know. The whiskey came from Lydia. She knew I couldn't drink. She called the night I received it. What I can prove. Daniel drank it. He's in the hospital. Ricardo confirmed the toxin. She paused, staring at the space between the columns, the distance between truth and evidence. Then she closed the notebook, placed it beside the phone, and exhaled slowly. If someone had tried to take her life, she would not hand it over easily. That night, as the wind rattled the windows, Martha made her decision. She would not call the police. Not yet. She would find the truth herself, one careful step at a time. 2 days later, the road stretched long and pale under a gray Boston sky. Martha kept both hands on the steering wheel, her fingers stiff against the cold. The radio murmured low, something classical, strings moving without urgency until she turned it off. She preferred silence. It helped her think. The highway narrowed into city streets, and by the time she parked near Lydia's apartment complex, a faint drizzle had begun to fall. The building was made of glass and concrete, all sharp edges and mirrored surfaces. The kind of place where people never aged, just disappeared. She stood in the lobby for a moment, catching her breath before pressing the intercom. A voice came through, distant and slightly distorted. "Hello." "Lydia's." "It's me," Martha said quietly. "Your mother." There was a pause long enough for her to hear her own heartbeat. Then a soft click, and the door buzzed open. The elevator smelled of disinfectant and metal polish. When the door slid open, Lydia was waiting in the hallway, barefoot, wearing a crisp white blouse and gray slacks. Her hair tied back too tight. "Mom," she said, voice careful, "what are you doing here?" Martha studied her daughter's face. The resemblance was sharp. Same jawline. Same quiet fire behind the eyes, but the warmth was gone. "I was in the city," Martha said simply. "Thought I'd visit." Lydia's apartment was immaculate. White walls, chrome fixtures, and the faint sterile scent of lemon cleaner. It didn't smell lived in, only maintained. She gestured to the couch. Do you want tea? No. Thank you. Martha sat, setting her purse carefully beside her. Inside it, the small recorder was already running. They made small talk at first, Lydia's freelance work. A new client in Cambridge, the weather in Maine. The rhythm of civility held for a while, fragile as glass. Then Martha said, softly, I wanted to thank you for the birthday gift. Lydia froze for half a second, a tiny twitch of her eyelid betraying something sharp beneath the calm. Oh, she said, forcing a smile. You got it. I wasn't sure if you'd even open it. I did, Martha replied. I thought it was thoughtful, but I don't drink anymore. So I gave it to Daniel Cooper. Lydia's hand, resting on her knee, stiffened. You gave it away? Martha nodded slowly. He liked whiskey. The silence that followed was heavy. Lydia looked down, then back up with a strange light in her eyes. You didn't keep it in the middle shelf, right? She asked casually. It needs to stay cool. Martha's breath caught. She hadn't told anyone, where she had stored that bottle before giving it away. Not even Linda. The middle shelf, she repeated, tone even. Lydia blinked, realizing her slip, and laughed too quickly. I just meant, whiskey tastes better when it's not warm. Martha smiled faintly, though her stomach felt like stone. Of course. They talked a few minutes longer, words shallow and mechanical. When Martha finally stood to leave, Lydia walked her to the door. Drive safe, she said, her voice brittle as porcelain. Outside, the drizzle had turned to rain. Martha paused under the awning, looking back once. Lydia was framed in the doorway, her silhouette sharp against the sterile white light. Martha turned away, walking toward her car. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel the usual tremor in her hands. She wasn't frightened anymore, only hollow, like someone who'd stepped beyond grief into clarity. By the time she reached the parking garage, the recording in her purse was still running, quietly, faithfully capturing the sound of truth unspoken. The police station in Bar Harbor was small and old, a red brick building that smelled faintly of wet paper and coffee gone cold. The flag outside barely moved in the wind. Martha stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside, clutching her purse close to her chest. The receptionist looked up, recognized the guarded look in her eyes, and called for Detective John Reyes. Reyes appeared a minute later, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a jacket that had seen too many winters. His tone was calm but firm. Mrs. Ellison? Come with me. His office was cluttered, but tidy in the way lawmen keep things, piles of files, a framed photograph of the harbor at dusk, and a corkboard pinned with timelines and maps. Martha sat across from him, setting her purse carefully on the desk. Her fingers worked at the clasp until it opened with a small click. I'm here to report a poisoning, she said quietly. Reyes didn't flinch. He reached for a notepad. Tell me everything. She laid each item on the desk one by one. The small glass vial wrapped in tissue, the sealed jar with the whiskey sample, and finally a USB drive with the recorded conversation. Each object made a faint sound against the wood, a rhythm that seemed to echo her heartbeat. She explained about the package, the bottle, Daniel's collapse, and the lab test from her friend Ricardo Vega. When she mentioned the words, white snakeroot toxin, Reyes raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, just kept writing. Your friend, Vega, he's not with law enforcement, he asked. No, Martha said. He works at the veterinary lab, but he can verify his findings. Reyes nodded. Good. We'll need to run our own analysis. The state crime lab in Augusta handles toxicology for criminal cases. He reached for a pair of gloves, opened a labeled evidence bag, and placed each item inside with slow precision, documenting the time and initials on the chain of custody form. I'll have these sent out today. Results take a few days. Martha clasped her hands in her lap, staring at the label on the evidence bag. The sight of her own name, printed in neat black ink beside the word victim, made her chest tighten. When she finished recounting the phone call with Lydia, Reyes leaned back in his chair. "Do you have any reason to believe your daughter would want to harm you?" The question landed like a stone. Martha opened her mouth, then closed it again. "Belief," she said finally, "isn't the same as proof." He studied her for a moment, then nodded, scribbling something on his pad. "For now, I need you not to contact her. Don't call, don't visit. If she reaches out, let me know immediately. You'll be safer that way." Martha nodded. "Safer," she repeated, though the word felt strange. Nothing about any of this felt safe. Reyes stood, gathering the evidence bags. "I'll be in touch as soon as we hear back from Augusta." She rose slowly, her legs heavy, and followed him to the door. The hallway smelled faintly of old carpet and rain. As she stepped outside, he called after her, voice low, almost gentle. "We'll find the truth, Mrs. Ellison, even if it hides in family blood." The words followed her out into the mist, where the air was colder than before, and the world seemed smaller, quieter, and infinitely more alone. The hospital was quieter now. A pale autumn sun streamed weakly through the tall windows of the recovery wing, painting the white floor with tired light. Machines beeped in slow rhythm beside Daniel's bed, marking time in cautious heartbeats. His color had returned slightly, though his voice was still faint, like a man speaking from a distance. Martha stood at the foot of the bed, watching Linda spoon a bit of water to his lips. The younger woman looked exhausted, her hair tied back, her hands trembling slightly as she set the cup down. "He's better," she whispered. "They said his heart's stabilizing. Another day or two, and he might be able to go home." "That's good," Martha said softly, though her eyes were somewhere else. Linda sank into the chair beside the bed. "They still don't know what poisoned him," she continued, "but the doctor said it wasn't just alcohol. Something else mixed in." Martha hesitated. Did Daniel ever mention that he'd spoken with Lydia? Linda frowned, confused. "Lydia? No, I barely knew her. We only met once, years ago at your house." She paused, looking thoughtful. "But now that you mention it, I remember something strange." Martha turned toward her. "What do you mean?" Linda tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, eyes unfocused as she searched her memory. Back when Lydia was visiting, she talked a lot about plants, how some could heal, others could kill. She was studying natural ingredients for a skincare line, remember? She said she wanted to create something purely botanical. Martha nodded slowly. She never finished that project. "No," Linda said, "but she collected books. Not the normal kind. She had one about toxic herbs. White snakeroot was in it. She said it fascinated her, that even something beautiful could be deadly." The words hit like a slow, heavy tide. Martha felt a chill crawl down her spine. Lydia hadn't stumbled upon the toxin by accident. She had known exactly what it was. That evening, after leaving the hospital, Martha drove back toward her old neighborhood, where Lydia once rented a small apartment before moving to Boston. Linda still kept the spare key. Lydia had left a few boxes there years ago. "I was planning to donate them," Linda said as they stepped inside the cluttered attic space. "Didn't think they mattered." The air smelled of dust and cedar. Under a stack of papers and an old printer, Martha found a slim silver laptop. Its battery was dead, but Linda handed her the charger. Together, they waited in silence as it booted up, the screen flickering to life with the faint hum of age. Martha clicked through folders, formulas, botanical trials, toxicity research. Her breath hitched as she opened one file labeled milk sickness, trematol compound stability. Inside were notes, measurements, and scanned pages detailing how white snakeroot could be distilled into a concentrated extract. Her hands trembled as she copied the folder onto a flash drive. "We can't keep this," she said quietly. Linda nodded, understanding without needing explanation. "You're taking it to the police?" "Yes." By the time Martha reached the Bar Harbor precinct the next morning, the air had turned crisp and clean after the night's rain. Detective Reyes met her at the door. She handed him the flash drive without a word. He studied her face for a moment before taking it gently. "What changed?" he asked. Martha's eyes were steady now, no longer clouded by doubt. "It's no longer suspicion, Detective. It's evidence." He nodded, tucking the drive into an evidence bag. For the first time since it began, the case had shape, and for the first time since Lydia's gift arrived, Martha felt something close to certainty, cold, heavy, and final. The wind that night carried a sharper chill than usual, the kind that slipped through the cracks beneath doors and whispered against window panes. Martha sat by the fireplace, a half-finished book in her lap. Though her eyes hadn't touched the words in an hour, the house was quiet, too quiet. Even the woods outside seemed to be holding their breath. When she finally rose to make tea, a faint sound came from the porch. Wood creaked, slow and deliberate. She froze, her pulse quickening. For a moment, she thought it might be a raccoon or a stray cat, but the rhythm of the steps was wrong, too heavy, too human. She reached for the small flashlight she kept near the counter and walked toward the front door. The beam of light fell across the knob. Where she saw it, a deep scratch in the brass, fresh and uneven, as if someone had tried to force it. The doormat was shifted slightly to the side, and at the base of the steps, the soil held a clear outline of a shoe print, larger than hers, recent. Her throat tightened, but she didn't panic. Instead, she reached for her phone, dialing a number she now knew by heart. "Detective Reyes," came the steady voice on the other end. "It's Martha Ellison," she said quietly. "Someone's been here." Within 20 minutes, a patrol car pulled into her driveway, its headlights cutting through the fog. Officer Jenkins, a young man with tired eyes, walked the perimeter with his flashlight while Reyes examined the door. He crouched down, running a finger along the scratch marks. "Could be a screwdriver," he muttered. "Doesn't look like they got in." Martha nodded, arms crossed over her cardigan. "I keep the doors locked. Always." "I'll have an officer drive by a few times each night," Reyes said. "Leave a light on in the kitchen window. Anyone watching will think someone's awake." After they left, the silence returned heavier than before. The fire had burned low, the coals glowing faintly like tired eyes. Martha locked the door again, double-checked the windows, and stood for a long time listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional groan of the old house settling. She tried to tell herself it was only her imagination, but her instincts whispered otherwise. The next morning, she stepped outside to fetch the mail. The fog still clung low to the ground, curling around the porch posts. Inside the mailbox was a single white envelope, no stamp, no name. Just her address, scrawled across the front in blue ink. The handwriting was unmistakable. Her hands shook slightly as she tore it open. Inside was a single photograph. Her house, this very house, taken from the tree lean across the road. The shot was recent. The lights were on in the kitchen window. Her silhouette faintly visible through the curtain. No message. No signature. Just silence printed on glossy paper. She stood there for a long moment, the cold seeping into her fingers. Then she turned, walked back inside, and locked the door once more. In the study, she opened the small fireproof safe beneath her desk and placed the photo inside, along with the USB drive, Ricardo's report, and the recording. When she turned the key, the click echoed through the empty house like a promise. Someone was watching her. But as the night deepened and the wind howled beyond the glass, Martha understood something vital. Fear didn't control her anymore. Not tonight. The search took place on a gray morning that smelled of rain and exhaust. Detective Reyes stood outside Lydia's apartment building in Boston, court order in hand. flanked by 2 officers from the state task force. The wind whipped against their coats as they waited for the manager to unlock the door. Inside, the space looked just as Martha had described it, immaculate, sterile, and unnervingly quiet. A vase of dead flowers sat on the counter, their stems brittle and colorless. Reyes pulled on gloves. "Start with the kitchen," he instructed. "Anything labeled, bottled, or stored separate, bag it." The officers moved efficiently, opening drawers, cupboards, and the refrigerator. Within minutes, one of them called out, "Detective, you'll want to see this." Inside a lower cabinet, behind rows of neatly stacked jars, sat 3 small glass bottles, each marked with a label in black marker. RC1, RCB, 2, RCB3. The liquid inside was faintly amber, slightly opaque. Reyes crouched to examine them. The smell, chemical, earthy, and faintly sweet, was unmistakable. On the table nearby lay a spiral notebook filled with dense handwriting. Measurements, dates, chemical ratios. He flipped a few pages until he found a heading written in sharp, deliberate strokes. RCB compound, derived from white snakeroot extract. He exhaled slowly. She wasn't experimenting, he murmured. She was perfecting. Then Officer Jenkins, now assigned to the Boston Division, appeared in the doorway holding an unsealed envelope. "Detective," this was in the desk drawer, addressed to Martha Ellison. Reyes took it carefully. The envelope was blank except for the name, written in the same left-leaning cursive that had once graced a birthday card. Inside was a single sheet of stationery, the words short and chilling. "You'll understand when it's over." By the time Martha arrived at the precinct that afternoon, Reyes had already logged the evidence. 3 vials, 1 notebook, 1 letter, all sealed, photographed, and sent to the state lab. She sat across from him, hands folded in her lap, face pale but composed. He hesitated before speaking. "We executed the search this morning," he said gently. "We found materials consistent with the toxin used in Daniel Cooper's case, and a letter addressed to you." He unfolded the page, his voice steady but low as he read aloud. When he finished, the room fell silent. The hum of the overhead light filled the space between them. Martha stared at the table, her expression unreadable. Minutes passed before she spoke. "Was she ever my daughter?" she whispered. "Or just my reflection? Something I created without meaning to?" Reyes didn't answer. Some questions he knew belonged to silence. After a long pause, he said, "She's gone, Martha. We checked her apartment, her workplace, her car. She disappeared last night before we got there. We've issued a statewide alert and notified Boston PD. There'll be a warrant out by morning." Martha nodded slowly, her voice almost a sigh. "So it begins." Reyes leaned forward, his tone resolute. "We're moving from suspicion to evidence now. This isn't just a theory anymore." Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall against the window. The case that had started with a bottle of whiskey had turned into something far darker, an echo between bloodlines, where love and destruction shared the same hand. 2 days later, the news came quietly, almost without ceremony. Detective Reyes called just after dawn, his tone steady but softened by fatigue. "We've got her," he said. "Lydia was found at a motel off Route 1 near Portland. She didn't resist." Martha sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam rising from her untouched tea. Outside, the pines shifted gently in the morning wind, the sea somewhere beyond the trees murmuring its endless rhythm. She didn't ask how they found her. She didn't need to. Later, at the precinct, Reyes filled in the details. "We recovered her laptop," he said, handing her a printed report. "Search history confirms everything. White snakeroot dosage, elderly heart failure, trematol extraction, and a message draft titled RCB formula, final test." He exhaled, rubbing his temple. She had a one-way ticket to Montreal. She never made it to the border. Martha listened without expression. There was no satisfaction in her eyes, only an exhausted calm. "What happens now?" she asked. "She's in custody. We'll move her to the county detention center until arraignment." Martha nodded, then looked past him toward the rain streaking the window. It wasn't triumph she felt, only a kind of mourning that had no proper ritual, an invisible funeral for the daughter she'd already lost long before the arrest. When she left the station, the sky hung low and silver, the air damp with salt. She drove straight to the hospital, where Daniel was beginning to walk again, pale but alive. Linda met her at the entrance, her smile cautious, uncertain. "He's better," she said softly. "The doctors say he'll make a full recovery." Inside the room, Daniel sat upright, sunlight catching on the metal watch band at his wrist, the one he'd once repaired for Martha's late husband years ago. She stepped closer, holding something small, wrapped in a handkerchief. "This belonged to you before," she said, placing it in his hand. "You fixed it when it stopped ticking. Maybe it's time it kept working for you." He looked at her, eyes glassy with gratitude. "You didn't have to." "I did," she interrupted gently, "because you drank what was meant for me." For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the slow rhythm of the heart monitor, steady now, patient. When she finally turned to leave, Linda hugged her tightly, whispering, "It's over now." Martha shook her head, faintly. "No," she said, her voice low but firm. "It's never over. It just changes shape." Outside the hospital, the evening air carried the faint scent of rain and pine. She paused on the steps, looking out across the parking lot as the first lights flickered on. Somewhere behind her, machines continued to beep in rhythm with life returning. She drew a slow breath, the kind that closed a circle. "Justice doesn't shout," she whispered to the wind. "It just arrives." The afternoon light slanted through the trees, thin and golden, brushing over the porch where Martha sat wrapped in her old wool shawl. The air smelled faintly of salt and pine needles, the sea murmuring in the distance like a lullaby for ghosts. The maple leaves had turned brittle, drifting across the steps in slow spirals before settling among the roots. The world felt quiet again, too quiet. Her phone buzzed once on the table beside her. She let it ring twice before answering. It was Detective Reyes. His voice carried that steady professionalism she had come to know, but beneath it lay a note of weariness. "Mrs. Ellison," he said, "I thought you should hear it from me first. Lydia confessed during the interview this morning." Martha's fingers tightened around the edge of her shawl, though her face remained calm. She admitted to everything. "Yes," he said. "She said she'd tested the compound, planned it weeks in advance. Said it was meant to be poetic, a way to end the distance between you." He hesitated. "She doesn't want a lawyer. Just kept saying, 'Mom will understand.'" For a long time, Martha didn't speak. The sound of the ocean filled the silence between them. Finally, she whispered, "There's nothing to understand, Detective. Only what's left." "I know," Reyes said softly. "I'll keep you updated on the proceedings." When the call ended, she didn't move right away. The porch creaked beneath her chair as she looked out toward the line of trees swaying in the wind. Somewhere out there, the world was still turning, indifferent to the small tragedies that unfolded beneath its skies. She reached for the notebook that always sat beside her and opened it to the first page, the one where she had written what I know and what I can prove. The ink had faded slightly, but the truth no longer needed proof. She had found it, carried it, and now it was done. Her gaze softened as her mind drifted back through the years, to a kitchen window fogged with morning steam, to a little girl perched at the table with her tongue between her teeth, practicing the loops and curls of her letters. Lydia had written "Happy Birthday" over and over again, until the words filled the page in uneven lines. Martha had laughed then, touching the smudge of ink on her daughter's cheek. That memory came back now, not as pain, but as something quieter, like the echo of a song she once knew. Somewhere along the way, love had turned into silence, and silence had hardened into distance. She looked out toward the horizon where the ocean met the fading sky and spoke softly, her words carried by the wind. She thought poison was the way to end things, Martha said. But silence was what killed us long ago. Inside, the old clock on the mantel began to tick, a slow, patient rhythm filling the empty house. It was the only sound left, steady and eternal, marking the quiet after everything had already been said.